The fog covered Seattle like a thick blanket on that winter night. Beth Newman adjusted the car heater as she drove through the wet streets of Green Lake neighborhood. The headlights of other vehicles created diffuse halos through the mist, like fireflies lost in the darkness. It was almost 9 o'clock, and she could still feel the weight of the workday on her shoulders. Just a few more blocks, she murmured to herself, thinking of the comfort of her home, her husband Richard's embrace, and her children's smiles. As the car advanced along Roosevelt Way, her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. There was something different in the air, a restlessness she couldn't explain. The radio played softly an old Bruce Springsteen song, and Beth found herself humming along distractedly. Her thoughts wandered to the meeting she would have the next morning, another presentation of results, more numbers to analyze. After 30 years as an accountant, spreadsheets and balance sheets had become her second nature. That's when it happened. At the curve near the bus terminal, a pair of headlights suddenly appeared on the wrong side of the road. Time seemed to slow down as Beth processed the scene, a car out of control coming towards her. Her reflexes acted before she could think. She jerked the steering wheel sharply, trying to swerve. "Oh my God," was all she could say before the tires lost traction on the wet asphalt. The world began to spin in slow motion. In that moment, suspended between life and the inevitable, flashes of memory flooded her mind like old photographs. The smell of coffee on Sunday mornings, when Richard prepared breakfast for the whole family. The first baby tooth of her youngest son kept lovingly in a small box. Her daughter's proud smile at her college graduation. The tight hug from her mother, now deceased, saying everything would be all right. The impact came like thunder. Twisted metal, shattered glass, a scream cut short, and then silence. A deep silence, unlike anything Beth had ever experienced. When she opened her eyes again, the first thing she noticed was the absence of pain. She was floating a few feet above the accident scene, observing with surreal clarity the paramedics, who had just arrived. She could see her own body trapped in the wreckage of the car, a sight that should have been terrifying, but strangely didn't cause her fear. "She's in cardiac arrest," shouted one of the paramedics, initiating resuscitation maneuvers. Beth observed everything with an inexplicable serenity. It was as if all earthly concerns, bills to pay, reports to deliver, urgent appointments, had completely lost their meaning. That's when she noticed someone's presence beside her. Grandma Connie, her grandmother, who had passed away more than 2 decades ago, smiled at her with that same loving look that Beth kept in her memory. "Come, my child," she said softly, extending her hand. Before she could respond, a light began to form in the distance. It wasn't like any light she had ever seen before. It was alive, pulsating, and emanated a love so profound that it made her eyes fill with tears. The light approached, growing, enveloping everything around her. "Help! We're losing her!" The distant voice of the paramedic echoed increasingly faintly as Beth felt drawn to that luminous presence. It was as if her entire life had been just a preparation for this moment. In her last moments of earthly consciousness, a crystalline thought crossed her mind. So this is how it all ends. But something inside her knew it wasn't an end. It was just the beginning of a much greater journey. The sounds of the material world gradually diminished. The ambulance sirens, the agitated voices of the paramedics, the noise of rain on the asphalt. Everything was being replaced by an indescribable melody, a harmony that seemed to come from all directions and nowhere at the same time. As she approached the light, Beth began to understand truths that could never be expressed in human words. It was as if every cell of her being vibrated in tune with the universe, as if she was finally returning home after a long journey. "Grandma." Connie still held her hand, guiding her through that transition. "Don't be afraid," her grandmother whispered as they crossed the threshold between worlds together. "You're about to understand the true meaning of everything." And so, while her body lay motionless on the wet asphalt of Seattle, Beth Newman's consciousness embarked on a journey that would forever change her understanding of life, death, and the purpose of her existence. The light that enveloped Beth wasn't just brightness, it was pure knowledge, unconditional love, absolute truth. Every particle of her being vibrated at a different frequency, as if it was being tuned to a much broader reality than the one she had known throughout her earthly life. Beside her, Grandma Connie smiled with that serene wisdom that only ancient souls possess. "Look, my child," she said, pointing to something Beth couldn't exactly see but could feel with impressive clarity. "Here, everything is more real than the world you knew." As her spiritual eyes adapted, Beth began to perceive shapes and colors that didn't exist in the earthly visible spectrum. It was as if she was seeing with her heart, not with her eyes. Emotions had colors, thoughts had form, and love. Love was a tangible force that connected everything and everyone. That's when she saw him. A majestic presence made of pure light, love, and wisdom. She needed no introductions. Her spirit instantly recognized. It was Jesus. Not the Jesus of Renaissance paintings or plaster statues, but the living, pulsating Christ, whose energy emanated infinite compassion. "Master," Beth tried to kneel but realized she no longer had a physical body. She was pure consciousness, pure energy. Jesus smiled, and in that smile was contained the entire history of the universe. Without words, through a communication that transcended language, Jesus began to show Beth the movie of her life. But it wasn't a simple retrospective. Each scene came accompanied by a deep understanding of its impacts on the great fabric of existence. She saw herself as a child, sharing her lunch with a poor classmate at school. In that simple moment, a seed of kindness had been planted in that girl's heart, who years later would become a social worker, dedicated to helping underprivileged children. She also witnessed moments she wasn't proud of, the times she ignored people in need, too busy with her own concerns, the harsh words said in moments of anger, the opportunities to do good that she let pass out of fear or complacency. I don't deserve to be here," she murmured, feeling the weight of her failures. The answer came not in words, but in a wave of love so intense that it made her tremble. "No one deserves its all grace." Jesus then showed her a profound truth about forgiveness. She saw people who, even in the face of evident miracles, chose to harden their hearts out of pride or envy. She understood that blasphemy against the Holy Spirit wasn't a specific sin, but a posture of conscious and continued rejection of divine truth. "It's like closing the curtains and complaining about the darkness," explained Grandma Connie, who remained by her side. "The sun keeps shining out there, but the person chooses not to see." Beth felt immense compassion for those who close themselves off to the light like this. How many times had she herself been close to hardening her heart, too focused on her material achievements? The next revelation left her breathless. She saw how each small act of kindness created waves of light that spread throughout the universe, affecting people she didn't even know. A sincere smile to a stranger could change the course of a day, which changed the course of a life, which changed the world. "So, everything matters?" she asked, marveling at the interconnection of all things. "Everything," her grandmother replied. "Each thought, each word, each gesture, nothing is lost in the great fabric of divine love." As she absorbed these truths, Beth began to feel a peace she had never experienced before. It was as if all the pieces of the puzzle of existence finally fit together, revealing a picture of indescribable beauty. However, something began to change. The light, which before had completely enveloped her, began to pulse in a different way. Jesus looked at her with infinite tenderness, and Beth knew without needing words that there was more to be done. "It's not your time yet," said Grandma Connie, holding her hands. "You have a purpose to fulfill." "But I want to stay," protested Beth, feeling for the first time fear of returning. How could she go back to the world of shadows after having known the true light? The answer came in the form of a vision. She saw people being touched by her testimony, hardened hearts opening to divine love, lives being transformed through her story. "You will be a bridge," said her grandmother, "between the visible and the invisible, between the temporal and the eternal." Before she could respond, Beth felt an immense pull. The light began to recede. The celestial colors were losing intensity, and the last thing she heard was Jesus' loving voice. "I will be with you." The first sound Beth heard was the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. Her heavy eyes struggled to open, as if they had been sealed for a long time. The characteristic smell of hospital invaded her nostrils: alcohol, disinfectant, medications. "Doctor! Dr. Andrew! She's waking up!" a female voice exclaimed, followed by hurried steps on the linoleum floor. Slowly the images began to come into focus: a white ceiling, fluorescent lights, medical equipment. Everything seemed strangely two-dimensional after the multidimensional reality she had experienced. "Mrs. Newman? Beth?" Dr. Andrew's deep voice sounded close. "Can you hear me?" She tried to respond, but her throat was too dry. A nurse brought a cup of water with a straw to her lips. The liquid went down refreshingly, awakening her senses even more. "Yes," she finally managed to whisper. How long?" "3 weeks," replied the doctor, checking her pupils with a small flashlight. "You've been in a coma for 3 weeks. Frankly, we didn't expect it. Well, it's a miracle." Miracle. The word echoed in her mind, bringing with it flashes of what she had experienced. The light, Jesus, her grandmother, the revelations. Everything seemed at once so close and so distant. "Richard," she suddenly exclaimed, remembering her husband. "He's in the cafeteria," the nurse reassured her. "He hasn't left the hospital since the accident. I'll call him right away." While waiting, Beth tried to organize her thoughts. Her body felt heavy and clumsy, like clothes that no longer fit right. Each breath was a conscious effort, each movement a negotiation with long dormant muscles. "Beth!" Richard's choked voice filled the room. His face showed the wear of the past few weeks. Deep dark circles, unshaven beard, eyes red from crying so much. "My love." She extended her trembling hand towards him, and he held it as if it was the most precious thing in the world. I thought I had lost you," Richard sobbed, kissing her hand repeatedly. "The doctors said the chances were minimal, but I couldn't give up. I prayed so much, Beth. So much." "I know," she smiled softly. "I saw you here every day." Richard frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "I need to tell you something," Beth began, but was interrupted by Dr. Andrew, who returned with a clipboard in his hands. "Let's take it easy," said the doctor. "You need to rest. We have to do some tests, check your cognitive functions." But Beth couldn't contain the urgency to share her experience. "Doctor, I need to tell. I saw things. Her voice trembled with the emotion of the still, vivid memory. "Mrs. Newman," Dr. Andrew gently interrupted, "it's common for patients in a coma to have dreams or hallucinations. Your brain was in an altered state for weeks." "They weren't dreams," Beth insisted, her voice gaining strength. "It was real. More real than anything I've ever experienced." Richard squeezed her hand, worried. The expression on his face oscillated between relief at seeing her awake and apprehension at what he was hearing. "I saw my own body after the accident," she continued. "I saw the paramedics trying to revive me. I was floating above the scene, without pain, without fear. And then, the light." Dr. Andrew made some notes on his clipboard, maintaining a neutral expression. In his 20 years of medicine, he had heard similar reports, but his scientific skepticism always prevailed. "And it wasn't just that," Beth went on, tears streaming down her face. "I met my grandmother, Connie. She guided me. And then, Jesus was there." Richard swallowed hard. "Are you sure it wasn't just a dream, Beth? You were badly hurt. The medications—" "You don't understand." She shook her head. "He showed me things. Truths that have always been there, but that we can never see with our earthly eyes. Each of our actions, each thought, each choice, everything is connected." The nurse who was checking the monitors paused for a moment, visibly touched by the account. Dr. Andrew, however, maintained his professional posture. "Mrs. Newman, let's focus on your physical recovery first, then we can—" "No." Beth raised herself a bit in the bed, surprising everyone with her sudden energy. "You need to understand. I came back for a reason. I have something important to share." That's when something inexplicable happened. As Beth spoke, the lights in the room began to flicker softly. A deep peace filled the environment, as if the air itself had transformed into palpable serenity. During my experience, she continued, her voice calm but firm, I learned about the only truly unforgivable sin. It's not something we do, but a conscious choice to close our hearts to divine truth, even when it manifests clearly before us. Dr. Andrew felt a shiver run down his spine. For a moment his rational mind wavered in the face of the supernatural atmosphere that seemed to envelop the room. As a doctor, she looked directly at him, you must have witnessed miracles that science can't explain, moments when the line between the possible and the impossible becomes thin. The doctor involuntarily remembered inexplicable cases he had witnessed throughout his career, miraculous recoveries, impossible coincidences, moments of synchronicity that defied logic. Some choose to ignore these signs, Beth continued. They call good evil, miracle coincidence, grace chance, not out of ignorance, but out of a deliberate choice to keep the heart closed. Richard, who had always been a practical man and not given to mysticism, felt strangely touched. Something in the way Beth spoke, in the depth of her gaze, in the peace that emanated from her, was different from anything he had ever experienced. Beth, he whispered, you're different. She smiled, a smile that seemed to contain all the wisdom of the universe. Yes, my love, because now I know. I know that we're not here by chance. Each encounter, each challenge, each moment of joy or pain, everything is part of a greater plan. The following days were a whirlwind of exams, visits, and adaptations. Beth's physical recovery surprised the medical team. Her reflexes returned quickly. Her motor coordination was re-establishing at an extraordinary pace, and her lucidity was impressive for someone who had been in a deep coma. It's scientifically inexplicable, muttered Dr. Andrew, analyzing the latest test results. The injuries you suffered would normally take months for partial recovery, if at all possible. Beth just smiled. She had learned not to argue, but to let the evidence itself speak. Her transformation went far beyond the physical. There was a different light in her eyes, a serenity in her words, a wisdom in her gestures that didn't go unnoticed. The visits began to multiply. First, her children, Peter, the eldest, a lawyer always so skeptical, and Mary, the youngest, a university professor. Then, work colleagues, friends, even people she barely knew, attracted by rumors of her extraordinary experience. Mum, Peter confronted her on a quiet afternoon, you've always been so rational. How can you believe you really saw all these things? Beth took her son's hand in hers. Darling, some truths can't be proven in a laboratory. They need to be experienced in the heart. But, he hesitated, his academic certainties coming into conflict with what he saw before him. It just seems so impossible, she completed softly. Like love, like consciousness, like life itself. Some things transcend our capacity for explanation, son. And that's okay. Mary, on the other hand, absorbed every word from her mother, with fascination. It's as if you brought a piece of heaven back with you, she commented, observing how her mother interacted with the nurses, other patients, even the cleaning staff, treating each one with special attention and love. One morning, while walking down the hospital corridor as part of her physical therapy, Beth heard sobs coming from one of the rooms. Following her heart, she entered silently. An elderly lady was sitting on the bed, crying softly. "Can I help?" Beth asked gently. The lady, who introduced herself as Mrs. Clara, told her between tears that she had received a terminal diagnosis. "I'm afraid," she confessed. "So afraid of what comes after." Beth sat beside her and, with infinite gentleness, began to share her experience. As she spoke, the fear in Mrs. Clara's eyes was gradually replaced by a deep peace. "So? It doesn't hurt?" asked the old lady, like a child seeking comfort. "No, my dear," Beth smiled. "It's like coming home after a long journey. It's all love. Everything else, the worries, the fears, the resentments, is left behind." The news about the woman who came back from beyond began to spread through Boston. What started as whispers in the hospital corridors soon turned into a story that captured the imagination of the city. Journalists tried to schedule interviews, Religious people sought validation of their beliefs. Skeptics approached with challenging questions. Dr. Andrew, who had initially maintained his skeptical stance, found himself increasingly intrigued. It wasn't just Beth's stories that made him question his certainties, but the inexplicable events that seemed to happen around her. One afternoon, while making his rounds, he found Beth talking to a young nurse in tears. Later, he discovered that the nurse had planned to take her own life that night. "She knew," the nurse said afterwards. "Without me saying anything, she just knew. And her words, it was as if light itself spoke through her." Richard also noticed profound changes in his wife. The Beth who had returned wasn't just a more serene version of his partner of 30 years. She was someone who seemed to see through layers of appearances, straight to the heart of people and situations. "You know," she said to him one night, as they watched the sunset through the hospital window, "before I was always running after time. Now I understand that time is just an illusion we create. What matters is the love we put into each moment." "But what about work? The accounting office?" asked Richard, concerned about practical aspects. Beth smiled tenderly. "I'll continue. Working, love. But now I know that each number I analyze represents stories, dreams, lives. They're not just data in a spreadsheet, they're manifestations of each person's journey." As her recovery progressed, Beth began to receive visits from people she didn't even know. A lady brought her terminally ill daughter seeking comfort. A successful businessman, tormented by ethical decisions, sought her guidance. A young priest came discreetly, questioning his own faith. For each one, Beth had a specific word, a unique understanding that seemed to come from a place beyond common knowledge. These weren't generic advice or platitudes. They were personalized truths that touched exactly the point needed. "How do you know exactly what each person needs to hear?" asked Marina one day, impressed by her mother's wisdom. "It's not me who knows, sweetheart," Beth responded with simplicity. "It's the divine love flowing through me. I learned that when we silence our ego, we become channels for something much greater than ourselves." One day, while alone in her room, Beth received an unexpected visit. It was an elderly nun, Sister Mary Catherine, known for her work with the homeless. "I came because I had a dream," said the religious woman, her eyes shining with a special intensity. "I saw a light guiding me to you, and now, looking into your eyes, I recognize that same light." The two women talked for hours. The nun shared her own mystical experiences, kept secret for decades. "Few understand," she said. "Many prefer the safety of their limited certainties rather than opening themselves to the divine mystery." "That's what I learned about," Beth replied. "The true sin is not honest doubt, but the refusal to see when truth clearly manifests before us. It's choosing darkness when light is available." After 6 weeks of hospitalization, the day of discharge arrived. The medical team had grown accustomed to Beth's luminous presence, and her departure would leave a void difficult to fill. "Mrs. Peterson," said Dr. Andrew as he signed the discharge papers, "I confess that your passage through this hospital has changed something in me. I can't explain it scientifically, but—" "You don't need to explain, Doctor," she smiled. "Some truths need to be felt, not explained." The doctor nodded, thoughtful. "You know, in 20 years of practice, I've learned to trust only concrete evidence. But your recovery, the changes I've witnessed, they defy everything I learned in medical books." "Science is wonderful, Doctor." "Andrew," Beth replied, "it helps us understand the how of things, but there's a deeper why that transcends the limits of the scientific method." As she packed her things, several people came to say goodbye, patients she had comforted, staff who had been touched by her presence, relatives of other inpatients who found peace in her words. One of the oldest nurses in the hospital, Mrs. Judith, hugged her crying. "You brought light to this place," she said. "Not just for the patients, but for all of us. How will we continue without your presence?" "The light isn't in me," Beth responded gently. "It's in each one of you. I just helped remind you of that." Richard arrived to pick her up, bringing new clothes. As she changed, Beth reflected on how it would be to return to everyday life. Not that she feared. She knew nothing would be the same as before, but that didn't scare her. She had a deep clarity about her purpose. "Ready?" asked Richard, picking. Sung up her small suitcase. Yes, she answered, looking one last time at the room that had been her home for the last few weeks. It's time to really begin my mission. Readjusting to everyday life brought unexpected challenges for Beth. The world seemed both familiar and completely new. Colors were more vibrant, sounds more meaningful, each moment charged with a greater purpose that she could now clearly perceive. Her return to the accounting office caused a commotion. Colleagues who knew the old Beth, always efficient but somewhat distant, didn't know how to react to her new presence. She still maintained her professional competence, but now there was something more. "Beth," called Mr. Anthony, an old client who was on the verge of bankruptcy, "I don't know how I'm going to deal with these overdue taxes. I'm thinking of, well, manipulating some numbers." In other times she would have just warned about the fiscal risks. But now, looking into the eyes of the grey-haired gentleman, she saw something deeper. "Mr. Anthony," she said softly, "do you remember why you started this business?" The man blinked, surprised. "Well, it was my father's dream. He built everything from scratch, and when he passed away." "And you've kept that dream alive for 30 years, she completed. "It won't be a difficult moment that will erase all that legacy of honesty and hard work." Tears welled up in the old businessman's eyes. For 2 hours, Beth worked with him, finding legal solutions, renegotiating deadlines, restructuring the business. More than a financial consultant, she became a soul counselor. At home, the transformations were also evident. Richard watched in wonder as his wife transformed the most mundane tasks into moments of connection and meaning. "You know," she said, one night as they prepared dinner together, "each meal is an opportunity to nourish not just the body, but the soul. The love we put into preparing food is as important as the ingredients." Peter, who had initially resisted his mother's changes, began to notice how his own cases at the law office gained new perspective through her insights. "Mom," he confessed one day, "I took on a difficult case, a family conflict over inheritance. Before I only saw the legal aspect, but after our conversations, you started to see the wounded hearts behind the lawsuits," she completed with an understanding smile. Marina, in turn, began incorporating some of her mother's teachings into her university classes. "It's amazing," she reported excitedly, "how students respond when we speak, not just to the intellect but to the soul." But it was through a support group that Beth found her true calling. It started informally, with people who had gone through near-death experiences gathering at her house to share their stories. "Nobody understands us," a young woman who had survived a drowning confided. "They think we're crazy or making up stories." "It's because some truths can only be understood through experience," Beth replied. "But our role isn't to convince anyone. It's to live what we've learned and let our light illuminate the path for others." The group grew quickly. Soon, it wasn't just people who had had near-death experiences, but also those seeking to understand the mysteries of life and death, spirituality, and the purpose of existence. On a particularly significant afternoon, as the support group gathered in the parish hall of Sacred Heart Church, which now housed their weekly meetings, Beth felt something different in the air. The light coming through the stained glass windows seemed more intense, the colors more vivid. "Today," she announced to the group waiting in expectant silence, "I need to share something I hadn't yet revealed about my experience." The hall was packed. Besides the regular group members, there were new visitors, including Dr. Andrew, who had been discreetly following the work of his former patient. "During my experience," Beth began, her voice soft but clear, "I received a profound understanding of the true meaning of divine love and free will. I understood that each soul that comes to this world has total freedom to choose its path." She paused, letting her words echo in the silent environment. "But with that freedom comes an immense responsibility. Each choice we make, every thought, every word, every action, creates waves that propagate through eternity, affecting not just our lives, but the entire fabric of existence." Dr. Andrew shifted in his chair, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was hearing. Beside him, an elderly lady was crying silently. "What was shown to me," Beth continued, "is that there is only one path that can definitively separate us from divine love, the conscious and persistent choice to Close our hearts to the truth when it clearly manifests before us. A murmur ran through the room. Some people looked at each other, others lowered their heads in deep reflection. It's not a sin to doubt, she clarified. It's not a sin to question, to struggle, or even to revolt against God. The only truly unforgivable sin is to deliberately harden one's heart when divine light manifests, calling good evil out of pride or envy. It was then that something extraordinary happened. As Beth spoke, a golden light began to form in the center of the hall. At first only a few noticed, a soft glow, like the reflection of the sun on a water surface. Each of us, she continued, her voice now charged with a serene authority, is called to be a channel of this divine light. We don't need to have near-death experiences for this. We just need to keep our hearts open, recognizing the truth when it presents itself. The light in the center of the hall grew more intense. Now everyone could clearly see. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't a lighting trick. It was something more, something that transcended physical reality. Dr. Andrew stood up abruptly, his eyes fixed on the inexplicable phenomenon before him. His rational mind desperately sought a scientific explanation, but his heart knew. This is what happens, Beth concluded, her words cutting through the reverent silence that had taken over the environment. When we choose to open ourselves to divine love, the light doesn't come from outside. It has always been within us. We just need to remove the veils that cover it. The event in the parish hall became a watershed moment. The people present that afternoon left transformed, carrying with them not just the memory of an inexplicable phenomenon, but a truth that had touched the deepest part of their souls. Dr. Andrew was one of the most impacted. The next day, he sought Beth in her office. Throughout my life, he confessed, I sought answers through science. I always believed that everything could be explained through reason and logic. But yesterday I saw something that challenged everything I've always believed in. Beth smiled with understanding. Science is a wonderful language to describe the how of things, Doctor, but there's a deeper why that can only be understood through the heart. News of the event spread quickly through Boston. Journalists tried to obtain statements. Religious figures sought explanations. Skeptics demanded proof. But Beth maintained her serenity, knowing that her mission was not to convince anyone, but simply to be a channel for truth to manifest. The support group grew exponentially. People came from all parts of the United States, some even from abroad, seeking to better understand the meaning of life, death, and existence. I'm not a guru, she always clarified. I'm just someone who had the privilege of glimpsing a greater truth and received the mission to share it. Richard, observing the transformation his wife had catalyzed in the community, commented one night, "It's incredible how your experience ended up affecting so many people." "It wasn't my experience, love," she replied tenderly. "It was the awakening of divine love that already existed in each heart. I just helped remove some veils." Marina, who had begun documenting the stories of people transformed by her mother's work, noticed an interesting pattern. "Mom," she said one day, "each person who goes through the group seems to awaken in a unique way. It's as if each one finds their own way to connect with this greater truth." "Exactly, sweetheart," Beth replied, "because divine love manifests in infinite forms, adapting to the need of each heart." Peter, who had initially been the most skeptical, was now one of the biggest defenders of his mother's work. His law office had transformed into a space of mediation and healing, where conflicts were resolved not just by law, but by mutual understanding and compassion. On a particularly significant morning, Beth woke up with an even greater clarity about her mission. She gathered her family and shared a final revelation. What happened to me, the accident, the near-death experience, the encounter with Jesus, was just the beginning. The true miracle is happening now, through each person who chooses to open their heart to the truth. As she spoke, the golden light that had manifested in the parish hall began to shine softly around her. But this time it wasn't an isolated phenomenon. Each person present could feel that same light growing within themselves. "This is the true purpose," Beth concluded, her eyes shining with infinite love. "It's not about one person, one experience, or one extraordinary event. It's about the collective awakening of divine love that dwells in each heart. And so what began as an individual near-death experience transformed into a movement of spiritual renewal, touching lives, transforming hearts, and reminding everyone of a fundamental truth. Divine love is always present, waiting only for us to choose to open our hearts to receive it.